All right, so it's 1:30, so we're gonna get started. Hi everyone, I'm Ryan Morrow from the Arabian Peninsula Institute. I'm also an investigative researcher at the Capital Research Center, where I specialize in researching nonprofit activity related to the Middle East conflict and radical Islam and those types of issues. We're really excited about our guest today, Jason Greenblatt. For those of you that follow these issues, you probably already know him. But he served as an assistant to the president and White House special envoy to the Middle East during the Trump administration. And in this role, Mr. Greenblatt served as one of the chief architects of the Peace to Prosperity plan between Israel and the Palestinians and between Israel and its Arab neighbors. He was a key player in laying the foundation and developing the relationships necessary for the Abraham Accords. Mr. Greenblatt now focuses on creating what he calls a Middle East 2.0, building economic bridges between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Jason is the Senior Director of Arab-Israel Diplomacy at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and the author of the widely acclaimed book, In the Path of Abraham, How Donald Trump Made Peace in the Middle East and How to Stop Joe Biden from Unmaking It, which is available on Amazon. Jason, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Why don't we get started with the most obvious question, which is how do you feel about the future of the Abraham Accords in light of the fighting between Israel and Hamas?
Well, thanks for having me at this very difficult, terrible time, really. You know, I think the long game is the game that I play, which is I'm optimistic still, very optimistic about the region. I realize that at the moment we're going through a horrific time, horrific because of atrocities perpetrated by Hamas, horrific because war is horrific, and there'll be a lot of death and destruction as a result of the war. But long term, the region understands that they need the Abraham Accords or things like the Abraham Accords. There'll be some countries that are going to want to wait until there's peace between Israel and the Palestinians. I believe that peace is now pushed way off in the distance because of what happened, although, you never know. But I'm not at all optimistic about that. And those countries that are going to sit on the sidelines until that happens, I think are not going to take advantage of an important opportunity for themselves and the region. Those countries that might have been on track, closer to signing something or at least discovering it, I think that when this war ends, and God willing it will end, and hopefully in a not too distant future, I think they will pick up the pieces. And the reason I say that is the region understands as well as Israel who the real enemy is here. Hamas does not represent the region. Hamas does not represent the future that the region wants. All of these countries have very specific goals and visions, Vision 2030 in the case of Saudi Arabia, others that may not have a brand or a name, but they all are taking their countries in ways that we only imagined back in 2017 when I joined the White House. And I think that they know that Hamas is a destructive force, not just with respect to Israel, but it and those that support it, such as the Iranian regime, are a destructive force for what the region wants to build for the future of a very young and excited population.
So why do countries like Qatar and Turkey help Hamas? And what do you see with the latest speech that came from Erdogan, where he basically threatened to declare war on Israel and to engage in military action against Israel? But what do you make of that?
Okay, so let's start with Turkey, because I think what the two countries do is very different from one another, even though they both are involved with Hamas. I think that President Erdogan's words speak for itself. He says Hamas is not a terror organization. He has said some very, very ugly things about Israel. This, by the way, not too long ago, he and Prime Minister Netanyahu were talking about reciprocal visits to one another's countries. I think Turkey's support for Hamas is atrocious. I think their support, their inability to condemn the terrorism, and what they've said about what happened is really bad for Turkey. It's bad for the region. And I hope that they reevaluate their position, because they're only hurting the Palestinian cause. Qatar, I view in a different lens, if you will. And I only want to speak about 2017 until today. I can't speak to what happened before I joined the White House. I didn't have the information available to me. Qatar's support of Gaza was done during President Trump's time, and I believe during President Biden's time, with the cooperation and support of Israel. Now, in retrospect, as Israel goes through an investigation after the war as to how they missed the attack, what the policies were that led to the attack, they may decide that that was a bad policy. And I get that. And, in hindsight, maybe they'll all decide it was a mistake. But whatever funding that they gave to Gaza was to alleviate the suffering of Palestinians of Gaza. The suffering, in my view, was primarily due to Hamas, of course, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but especially Hamas. Could Israel and Egypt have done things differently in theory if they felt safe, if they felt that they would not have suffered from terrorism? And turns out that Israel suffered a huge blow because of what happened. I think Israel probably made the wise choice of trying to block Hamas as much as they could, but they missed this big one, a huge one. But as far as the policy of Qatar, I think Qatar's view was if we could use our very rich country to help alleviate the suffering of Palestinians with Israel's approval, where they tried to take the temperature down, which they did successfully for a long time. And, this, of course, blew up. I view that as a very different approach than what Turkey did and says and does. But again, now that this has happened, everyone will look back and figure out, was that the right approach? Is it the right approach? Should it be the approach moving forward?
Mhm. So, what has to happen for the track we were on with Abraham Accords, particularly in regards to diplomacy with Saudi Arabia? What has to happen for that to continue? Because one answer could possibly be, oh, well, once Hamas is destroyed, but is that really even possible? Is it possible to kill every single Hamas terrorist? I don't know if it is. So what's like the realistic benchmark that everyone should be shooting for so that peace negotiations can get back to where they were?
I'm also not sure that it's a realistic goal to kill every Hamas operative. By some accounts, there's 30,000, by other
Mm.
accounts, 40, and I've heard as high as 50,000 Hamas fighters, terrorists. Plus, we don't know how many people in Gaza support Hamas. Then, of course, you have Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is not nearly as big as Hamas, but certainly numbers in the thousands. Nobody's sure exactly how many. I think that Israel's goal should be to kill all the leaders and destroy Hamas's infrastructure as well as Islamic Jihad's infrastructure to try to make it so two things happen. One, Palestinians in Gaza, of which there's 2+ million of them, no longer suffer under the subjugation of Hamas, that they get to live freely. We can figure out what the end game is if and when Israel is successful, who helps Palestinians succeed, who helps those 2 million and so Palestinians actually build something that they no longer have to suffer under the brutal regime of Hamas. But it's a function of killing as many of the leaders of Hamas and as many of the other terrorists of Hamas, certainly those that perpetrated the atrocious, horrific acts upon Israel, and trying to make sure that they never rear their ugly head again, as well as ripping out all of the infrastructure, the tunnels, the weapons, the missiles, the launchers, all of the things that they have within Gaza to create a new Hamas, if you will. And let's be clear, there is always going to be an element of society that wants to create, either resurrect Hamas or create a Hamas 2.0. Israel recognizes that. I'm sure the countries in the region recognize that. So Israel will have to do a really good job to not only eradicate as best as they can today's Hamas and today's Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but also try as best as they can to make sure that it doesn't reconstitute itself. And that, of course, is going to create new security challenges for Israel, new security rules, whether they have to be more of a military that goes on the offense, which they are loath to do generally, or they don't. I think it's a bit too soon to tell, and we'll have to see how this war proceeds. As far as how to get back on track, I think at the moment, all the countries should sort of take a deep breath. Israel has to focus on doing its job in Gaza to eradicate Hamas, ideally with as few civilian deaths as possible. I don't even know if it's possible, given how Hamas hides within a civilian population. Its entire infrastructure is embedded in the civilian population. So it's extraordinarily challenging for Israel to be able to differentiate between Hamas terrorists and civilians, innocent civilians. But once this is over, and I'm confident it will be over, I think that's the time that the region could sort of take a breath and get together and figure out, okay, when and how can we now move forward and figure out how do we make better lives for the Palestinians? How do we ensure Israel that something like this never happens again? And how do we start building those bridges that we successfully built, President Trump's administration successfully built with the Abraham Accords, and start spreading that beyond the current Abraham Accords countries? Because it is essential, I believe, to the national security of the region. It's useful, very, very useful and important for the economies of the region. But to me, the most important thing is national security for each of these countries.
Mhm. So I saw a poll, believe it was from the Washington Institute. I found that I believe it was 57 percent of people in Gaza, I mean, referring to the adults, that had a positive opinion of Hamas, and 3/4 had a positive opinion of Lion's Den and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorist organizations. So, with there being such popular support in Gaza, and then of course, there's a lot of support for Hamas in the West Bank. How do you envision Israel handling that? Like, would they have to have a long-term occupation of the Gaza Strip, or how do they stop a regeneration of Hamas's support after the leaders are killed and all of that dismantling takes place?
So polls are tricky in this part of the world, right? There are Palestinians who probably are afraid to speak the truth, and therefore the poll numbers actually may be worse than the numbers you're citing, or they may be better in case they felt obligated to say they support Hamas. But that certainly sounds correct to me. If I had to guess, I would say it's potentially even worse than those numbers that you cited. But let's go off those numbers. I think the last thing that Israel wants is to occupy Gaza. They left it a long time ago. They left Gaza with the potential, irrespective of what people call a two-state solution, which is not a phrase that I like to use, but they left Gaza with the potential of creating something really magnificent for Gaza. It is prime real estate. It is prime beachfront property. They left Gaza with all sorts of neighborhoods and greenhouses and lots of other things, which Hamas immediately destroyed. And that destroyed everything for Gaza right off the bat. The world's eyes are on Gaza. The world, rightly so, is sympathetic with the Palestinians who live in Gaza. And I think that the world, if they were assured that Israel would achieve its goal of eradicating Hamas and preventing a new Hamas from rising, might be willing to invest in Gaza. One of the things that was the most difficult for us in terms of challenges, and we failed, was trying to figure out how to help the 2 million Palestinians of Gaza. This is back when I was in the White House, how to help them. We convened a conference, for example, with many countries from around the world, politics aside, whatever your thoughts were about a two-state solution, no two-state solution, whatever it was. How do we join forces together as a group of countries, many countries, and help the people of Gaza? And what happened? Nobody, not one country, our own administration included, of course, was willing to put serious money in, because the cycle always continues. You build, Hamas shoots rockets or Islamic Jihad shoots rockets, things get destroyed. Nobody felt that that was a wise use of their taxpayer money. We're going to face that same issue again if, assuming Israel is successful at eradicating Hamas, and even, of course, even if Israel is not successful. Nobody wants to buy in to an endless war zone. And I think it's going to be important for Palestinians to recognize that. Yes, they suffer, it's true. But why they suffer is because their leadership cares nothing about them. Their leadership is just, and I'm speaking specifically of Gaza now, their leadership, specifically their charter, Hamas's charter, speaks about the destruction of the state of Israel. There's very few countries in the world that are going to give any meaningful money to build up Gaza if that threat isn't removed. So it's an excellent question. It's a bit premature because we don't know how the war is going to unfold. We don't know how much damage is going to be done. And we don't know what the end result is going to be. So while there's a lot of talk and appropriate questions from journalists and others who say, what's the end game? What happens the day after? I think it's just too soon to plan for a day after. I think that as people plan for a day after, it's probably going to include some sort of international force and international governance, whether that's Arab countries alone, UN plus Arab countries, potentially the US playing a role, though I'm not sure that's worthwhile, I'm sure Israel will play some security oversight role, but I doubt that they should or would want to do more than that. And only then can you figure out how, if, and how much things can be rebuilt so that Gaza can become something positive for the people, even in the absence of a full peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. I think that should happen. The same way I believe that the Abraham Accords showed that you don't have to wait for peace between Israel and the Palestinians, for Israel and the Arab countries around it to actually have meaningful engagement, meaningful peace deals, meaningful relationships. I think that there's no reason the Palestinians in Gaza, or for that matter, in what probably your audience would call the West Bank, and what I would call Judea and Samaria, there's no reason Palestinians have to not move forward economically and socially and have thriving societies in the absence of a formal peace deal. Of course, it's much better to have a peace deal. I don't want you to misunderstand that. But a peace deal wasn't in the cards when we were in the White House. It wasn't in the cards at the beginning of the Biden administration. And he said that, and I absolutely agreed with him then. And right now, it's just been pushed further and further away. Although, interestingly, he has been saying that the day after should include the negotiation of a framework for a two-state solution. I think that's a mistake. I don't think now's the time after these atrocities to even begin to address that. But I do think it will come a time very quickly to at least improve Palestinian lives. And then, as that's happening, we could talk about how and if the Israeli-Palestinian conflict could be resolved.
So is it your belief that as the economy and opportunities increase for the Palestinians in the West Bank, as that happens, that the level of radicalism will decrease? Is that the calculus?
I hate to answer your question with a yes and a no, but I have to.
Sure. Go for it.
Yes, and it was very much a part of our doctrine. I don't know if the Biden administration bought into that doctrine or simply didn't really think it was ripe for doing anything. But our view is, one, Palestinians deserve better lives. Two, yes, as better lives occur, radicalization reduces. The reason I'll say no is because at the time we had, and I'm sure still exists, and I hope doesn't exist beyond this war, but probably will, especially in, I'll use the term West Bank, there are always spoilers. There are always people who say ours is a political cause, meaning Palestinians. We're not interested in bettering our society. We're not interested in more profitable or luxurious or economic advantages. We simply want what we view as our political rights. And I'll tell you that every economic initiative that we tried to achieve, not just in Gaza, but throughout the West Bank, was always blocked. It was, of course, blocked in Gaza for obvious reasons, but it was also blocked in the West Bank because the Palestinian Authority had no desire whatsoever to improve the economic situation among Palestinians in the West Bank. It didn't work for their narrative. It didn't work for their approach. They felt that Palestinians would become, I'll use this expression that somebody once told me, it's not my expression, fat and lazy. And they were very, very against doing it. I'll take it just to show you a concrete example. This is only one of many. Jared Kushner, who ran the team, came up with the idea of creating a conference in Manama in Bahrain to show what the Palestinians could look forward to if they were able to take advantage of an economic plan that the White House had crafted for them. And we brought a lot of heavy hitters to that conference. Palestinian Authority not only boycotted it, they encouraged other countries to boycott it, and they threatened to put Palestinians who came to the conference in jail. There were a small group of brave Palestinians who showed up, and yes, some of them actually did get thrown in jail after the conference. We succeeded in getting them released, but the entire concept of building economic success flies in the face of the Palestinian leadership's narrative, much to the detriment and frustration of ordinary Palestinians.
So what was the reason that the Palestinian Authority gave for boycotting that event and threatening Palestinians? I'm not saying it's necessarily true what they said, but what was the reason that they gave?
They said that our whole approach was simply to buy off Palestinians. This was an economic plan only. Now, to be fair to them, we had always discussed, we put in an economic plan into our peace plan. We felt that a detailed peace plan plus an economic plan was necessary to show what could happen the day after if there was peace. And we debated, do we want to release the political plan first? Do we want to release the economic plan first? Do we want to release them at the same time? For a variety of reasons, including multiple Israeli election cycles, the political plan wasn't yet ripe to be released, but at the time we wanted to. But the economic plan certainly was. And we felt that with the right, marketing, if you will, where we were absolutely clear that this was only one part of a two-part plan, that there was a political plan that was ready, it would be released at the right time. But in advance of the political plan, we wanted to release a robust economic plan so people could understand what can happen, the incredible possibilities for Palestinian society, if and only if and when the political plan succeeds or some variation of the political plan would succeed. We bent over backwards saying it that way. And the Palestinian Authority, to answer your question directly, bent over backwards to say that this was all a trick from the White House, that we were doing nothing other than trying to buy them off, that nobody should pay attention because this was just a basket full of lies. That's not an exact quote, but that was more or less the message coming out from the Palestinian Authority.
Wow. So let's talk about the current administration. I think we all share the objectives, both sides, of somehow getting the Abraham Accords again to move forward, to secure Israel, and various other objectives that we've talked about. How do you assess what is basically the Biden administration's policy or strategy, and how much does that conflict or coincide with what you've proposed in your book and your speeches and everything else that you envision that should happen?
Yeah. So I'll start with pre-October 7th. I've been critical about President Biden for a whole host of reasons in the region. Number one, how he treated the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. That has since been fixed, so good for him. Just generally speaking, I think he was mishandling the Abraham Accords from the start. You didn't even want to use the name Abraham Accords. I think he tried to mix in Israeli-Palestinian peace into the Abraham Accords, all of which I thought was a mistake. We finally removed the veto card, if you will, from the Palestinians in order for the countries of the region who wanted to make peace with Israel to move forward in that direction. He tried to bring them all back together, which I think was a mistake. I had other criticisms as well. Now, fast forward to October 7 and in the ensuing weeks, I've been very complimentary of President Biden. I try really hard not to be a political person, especially when it comes to the Middle East and countries that I'm deeply passionate about. I think how he has stood with Israel has been excellent. I think he's sending a signal to the world, and in particular the Iranian regime and its proxies, that America stands with Israel, and that if they start up with Israel, they're going to be starting up with America as well. That doesn't mean that America should have boots on the ground. I'm not in favor of that. Israel's not in favor of that. But I think his remarks, his actions, visiting Israel when he did, sending the aircraft carriers as he's done, fighting back against the attacks on American positions, all of it really important, all of it excellent work. Messages coming out of the administration, whether it's John Kirby, who did what I thought was an excellent press conference the other day. I forget which journalist asked about, asked a very, I thought, narrow and shallow question, and he was excellent in how he responded to her. Jake Sullivan, I think, has been excellent. So on an overall basis, I give them an A. However, I do have my criticisms. Number one, I believe that they are hiding from acknowledging the Iranian regime's involvement in October 7th. They still say things like, well, we can't prove that Iran was directly involved in this attack. By the way, that may be true, but you need to, more forcefully than they've said, understand that Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, none of them could do anything or be where they are in terms of their training, in terms of their capacity, in terms of their fighting. They couldn't be anywhere without the Iranian regime. Certainly the money coming from the Iranian regime, the strategy, the education, and all that. The fact that they can't find that missing link, if you will, well, first of all, let's think about it. Apparently, and we'll find out as these investigations happen close to the end of the war or beyond the war, everybody missed what happened, right? The Israeli intelligence services missed the attack. Presumably, the US intelligence services missed the attack. So the fact that at this very moment, they don't have the actual linkage to this kind of massacre and attack, well, they didn't catch the attack itself in the massacre. So I'm not convinced by missing that link that the fact that they haven't found that link has any bearing on the discussion. It's just a misleading way to look at it. Don't hide the ball. Understand the Iranian regime is the source of this evil against Israel. It's the threat to the entire region. And I would be much, much more forceful on it. The second thing is they're bringing back in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, speaking about a two-state solution for after the war is over. I just think it's tone deaf. It's not the right time. I'm not saying we shouldn't encourage Palestinians and say, look, we do want better lives for you when this is over. And we will work, as America has always worked, to try to figure out how and if that's possible. But I think that's about all that should be said. We want to give Palestinians hope, but we also want to be realistic. Hamas, Palestinian terrorists, managed to perpetrate the most atrocious, heinous crime against Jews, against Israelis that has been perpetrated since the Holocaust. It's roughly the equivalent of 40 to 50,000 Americans being killed, to put it into perspective. Now's not the time to talk about a two-state solution. It rings hollow. It's going to ring on deaf ears in Israel. So I think they should tone that down. I think their constant messaging within their saying Israel has the right to defend itself, and then they have to say, so long as they comply with international law, it's just an unnecessary statement. Like the United States and some, maybe not all, certainly not all, but some other countries around the world, Israel knows very well its obligations under international law, under the law. It has a very moral and ethical army. It's not going to do anything other than potentially by a real big mistake. It's not going to do anything that intentionally violates the law or violates international law. They don't need a lecture from the Biden administration to do it. Does that sound good to others who like to say it and hear it? Fine. But I think it detracts from the trust that the Biden administration happens. It's implicit that when the United States of America says it supports Israel's right to defend itself, which of course is obvious, every country has the right to defend itself, it's implicit that that means to try to minimize civilian loss to the extent possible. When they're saying to try to differentiate between terrorist fighters and civilians, I don't even know how that's possible. Yeah, occasionally you will be able to, because you'll find a Palestinian terrorist with a gun or some other weapon or holding a rocket launcher button in his hand. Well, that's an easy differentiation. But when you're talking about tens of thousands of terrorists who hide among the civilian population, under the hospitals, under the UNRWA schools, within the hospitals, that's a tall order.
For sure. All right, so we got one question that came in from the audience. Looking at the Middle East, everything changed in 1979, including the Arab world's position with Israel. The destruction of Israel no longer ran through Cairo, but through Tehran and Tripoli. With this administration wedded to an Iranian nuclear policy, have they just been going through the motions with the Abraham Accords?
I try not to criticize administrations I'm not a part of if I don't have inside baseball knowledge, right? So I'll answer the question, but I want you to understand that this is my own thoughts and formulation based on all the reading that I do in the newspapers, accounts that I understand from high-level officials, not in the US government, by the way. I do think that after about a year of ignoring the Abraham Accords, not wanting to use the Abraham Accords name, the administration picked up the mantle and seriously did try to work on the Abraham Accords. Now, we could be cynical and say it was a result of the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan that the United States had. Maybe there's truth to that. Maybe it's a bit harsh for me to say it's cynical. There could be lots of reasons why it happened. But I think the administration, the Biden administration, did sincerely try to work on encouraging other countries to join the Abraham Accords. One recent example is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, by all accounts, and the Crown Prince himself said this in his English language Fox News interview, which if your viewers have not seen it, I still recommend it. I recommended it, before October 7. I still recommend people watch it so they can hear directly from the Crown Prince what he wanted pre-October 7. I hope he continues to want it, maybe not today, but when things calm down a little bit. But let's remember that there were significant challenges to that peace deal between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and effectively the United States. The Crown Prince, and rightly so from a Saudi perspective, was asking for a variety of things from the United States that were important for Saudi Arabia. some sort of mutual defense pact, some sort of civil nuclear rights, weapons purchases, things like that. All of that makes complete sense for Saudi Arabia. They also wanted to make sure that something would be done with the Palestinians. That was undefined. That obviously brings Israel into the mix. And again, pre-October 7, that would have been challenging enough. Post-October 7 will be enormously challenging. So there were many obstacles and hoops to jump through still. And I would say, I said before October 7 that if it fails, I wouldn't blame it on President Biden himself, but I would say that whether it's Congress wouldn't give the Crown Prince what he demanded for Saudi Arabia. And again, I think his asks were smart. I don't want to make it seem like he was making unreasonable demands. I think that they were perfectly smart for Saudi Arabia. Whether it's because the Israeli government couldn't give Saudi Arabia what it asked for the Palestinians, we don't have enough details to know, but I do think they took it seriously. And I hope that once things calm down in this war, that, if there's time left in the Biden administration's tenure, that they're able to pick it up again, both with Saudi Arabia and with others in the region. As a diplomat, now I'm a recovering diplomat, but you have to be a realist and an optimist and a pessimist all at the same time. I think more often than not, my optimism bone tries to control me. So I'm still optimistic, even if at these particular times we're living in very, very dark, gloomy times.
Okay, next question we got in. To preserve their interests in the region, our countries are pursuing significant defense treaties with the United States. Also, to avoid Iranian militias, Saudi Arabia reached a China-sponsored agreement with Iran. After the current war, should Israel, with U.S. help, win the war decisively so that the peace process may continue and the U.S. can preserve its influence in the Middle East?
It's a bit confusing. I'll address part of the
Yeah,
question that I understood, and then I may need a little
sure.
clarification. These defense pacts with the US are actually proving to be far more important than ever before. Israel technically does not have such a defense pact with the United States yet under President Biden, and I have no reason to think that President Trump would not have done the same thing. And I hope that whoever the next occupant of the Oval Office is will do the same thing. What the Biden administration is doing is essential to the security of Israel in terms of this current war, especially if it turns into a multi-front war. I mean, right now we have a big front in Gaza. We have a somewhat escalating front with Hezbollah in Lebanon. That may escalate further, and it may become a bigger front as well. And we had Houthis firing missiles as well. I think it's essential for Israel's security to have this security backup that the Biden administration is giving. And I'll take it a step further. I think all the countries in the region need and require the same thing. So my hope is that the Biden administration, or whoever, if it lasts longer than the current administration, works seriously with our allies and friends in the region. There used to be an expression, something along the lines that when the Middle East sneezes, the United States, probably the world, catches a cold. Now I would say when the Middle East sneezes, and this is far more than a sneeze going on right now, the United States and a lot of the world is going to catch the absolute worst form of COVID. So I think we need to look at these security arrangements in a very, very serious way. And I think and this is why I'm such a believer in the Abraham Accords potential, is the partnership between Israel and the Arab countries, coupled with the United States, is the only way to fend off terrorism from the Iranian regime and its proxies and outliers who may or may not be connected with the Iranian regime, all of whom I'm firmly convinced not only want to destroy Israel, but want to take over all these amazing buildings and projects and exciting things happening throughout Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, etc.
Mhm. So why don't you tell us a bit about what you envision as the Middle East 2.0, you've called it. We mentioned in your bio that that's focused on building economic bridges between Israel and its neighbors. Can you give us kind of what your vision is long term for the Middle East 2.0?
Yeah, I think it's taking the Abraham Accords and putting it on steroids. Each of these countries can do without Israel, and Israel can do without them. Let's be honest, right? Meaning Israel's thrived, and the Arab countries have thrived, meaning the Gulf countries generally have thrived as well. They have money, they have oil, they're weaning themselves off oil over time. That's true. They could do it without Israel. And Israel, while it's great to have Arab investment in Israel technology and all that, Israel has managed to create something incredible in its short history. But if they partner together on an economic basis, I think that they will just take off. I shouldn't use the word rocket today, but it's always been my go-to metaphor. They'll take off like a rocket. I'm not a believer in Europe. I think Europe is on the downswing. I think the United States is still, despite its challenges, and we have many, way on the upswing. But I'm a huge believer in the Middle East. And I think a Middle East with Israel and its Arab partners working together on the economy, on things like climate, on things like agriculture, and certainly security, which we spent a lot of time on already, will just make the region safer, richer, better place to live. Not rely on all sorts of challenges regarding supply, food, and all that. So I think there's a lot to be said for that. Until October 7, I was saying lots of it. I was saying not just with the Abraham Accords countries, but others who were just interested in taking tentative steps, very tentative, sometimes under the radar, sometimes a little bit above the radar, nothing too splashy. But I think they were all starting to learn one another. Tourism. I mean, tourism is such a big part of the region. Israel's always been successful in tourism. Parts of the UAE, in particular Dubai, always been successful. They go through ebbs and flows and all that. But if you compare them to other countries in the region who are painted with a sort of, oh, it's too dangerous and therefore their tourism isn't high, they've done a remarkable job. But now tourism has come forward, again, pre-October 7, and hopefully once this war is over. Tourism is such an important part of the component of the transformation of all of these countries. And if we could take the temperature down in terms of safety and create what, for example, Israel and the UAE had, if I'm not mistaken, they had over 1 million Israelis visiting the UAE since the Abraham Accords were signed. Israel's a tiny country. Imagine what would happen if everybody believes the way I do in the Middle East. And everybody's looking forward to visiting what's being built throughout the Middle East, all these Saudi projects. So they don't just get, some from Asia, some from Europe, but tons of North Americans coming of whatever religion or no religion or persuasion. I think that's an example of how this Abraham Accords or Middle East 2.0 can thrive and prosper. And once you have all that intermixing and intermingling, it's also hopefully going to keep the temperature down a little bit because we have so many walls between us, whether it's Jew, Muslim, Christian, Arab, non-Arab, European, American, Middle Eastern, it doesn't matter. And we could see these walls sprung up after October 7th in horrible ways for all of our societies. Tourism is a way for everyone to be ambassadors to themselves, for their countries, for their religions, for their nationalities, for their aspirations. And I think that also helps bring people together in a way that reduces tension.
And we've got a question in about Saudi Arabia. How should Israel and the U.S. handle the apparent contradictions coming out of Saudi Arabia and other countries, such as claiming to condemn Hamas, but hosting Hamas leaders earlier in the year, coordinating with Qatar and Iran to blame Israel for the attack, having people like Turki al-Faisal repeat the lie that Gaza is occupied and that the attack was not provoked, having zero mention of normalization with Israel in Arabic language media prior to the attack, meaning that's like a lack of preparation of the public for any real peace effort. So what do you make of that, those mixed signals that we're getting, particularly out of Saudi Arabia?
I feel like the White House press secretary with a 10-part question being
Yeah,
well.
right.
Okay, well, you started with Saudi and then Qatar, so I'll start with Saudi. As a general rule, I wish most of the countries in the region had better statements about what happened on October 7th and beyond October 7th. I think most of them reacted too quickly. Most of them condemned Israel without really understanding what was going on. Some of them issued subsequent statements that helped somewhat. I think they could have done better. If I was in the White House, I'd like to think I would have picked up the phone and encouraged them to say more and do more. But they are what they are. And even there, and it ties a little bit to one of those sub questions about preparing the public. I don't like it, but I understand that they have their own populations to also kind of speak to. So in a perfect world, this statement would have been far better, but I understand where they're coming from. I've always understood where they're coming from. While I hate politics here in the United States, I give politicians here, and I guess leaders there, somewhat of a pass in order to speak to their audience because they're protecting the bigger picture, even if it doesn't um, hit my ear in a way that I like or I'm comfortable with. So I wouldn't put an incredible amount of stock on some of those statements. I won't say which country or why, but I think people should not judge these countries and where they really think, what they really think about what happened on October 7th, and what they really think about the potential goal of destroying Hamas, where these countries really are. I do think they need to prepare their publics. I do think over time efforts have been made. I think that's now been set back tremendously because of this war, and a lot of effort is going to have to go back into it in order to once again prepare the public. We saw this, and it was less so in most of the Gulf countries, but we saw this in Jordan as an example, where after the false attack on the false accusation that Israel bombed that hospital in Gaza, which turned out to be an errant missile coming from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, how quickly the public massed and protested in very, very strong ways that I'm no expert on this, but it evoked memories of 1979 Tehran when the U.S. embassy was taken over. So I think these countries have to be careful. I get it. I respect it. And I give them the latitude. The one part I haven't addressed yet, and you can tell me if I missed something, is hosting Hamas. Qatar's position, as I understand it, I'm not quoting anybody here. I certainly don't speak for Qatar, but Qatar's position has been that they are a voice of rationality, reason, if you will, having these relationships with Hamas, as opposed to having Hamas leaders or ex-leaders or older leaders, however you want to style them, being housed in Iran, potentially Turkey or elsewhere. They felt that having them there with them allows them to play a certain kind of role when it's necessary in order to speak to Hamas leadership. And that goes back a little bit to the beginning of this conversation about funding Gaza and all that. I think we're seeing now, with the release of only a few, but hopefully more hostages, there's even reporting today about a potential deal being worked on. I think we're seeing that the role that they have played and can play in terms of things like that might seem to be extremely important, and they probably made a good decision in terms of doing it. I know it makes people uncomfortable, unhappy. I myself am conflicted on it to some degree, but I would say there's a logic, and if we see more hostages being released, and even those that were released, there is a lot of logic in terms of having a trusted U.S. partner, an address, if you will, for the United States and other nations, by the way, calling up Qatar and saying, we need your help. We know you could help. Because if we didn't have Qatar, I'm not sure who those calls would go to. But like everything else, I think after the war is over, there'll be a lot of soul searching. There'll be a lot of discussion. Was it the right policy? And even if it was, is it the right continued policy? My gut today, and I don't know the answer, and I'm not in the U.S. government now, but my gut today is after this is over, I think it might be time for Qatar to say sayonara to Hamas.
Mm. Okay, and the last question is, do you think the Arab and Muslim public opinion and anger will control the Arab leaders' decisions in regard to the future of normalization deals with Israel? So I think what that question is getting at is how polls have shown just overwhelming opposition to normalizing relations with Israel among the public in places like Saudi Arabia and throughout. So will, I guess, the hostility towards Israel make it impossible for the leaders to move forward with Israel, or do they have the strength and conviction to go against the public opinion of their own audiences?
Control, no. I think it'll influence for sure. Control, no. Impossible, no. Nothing's impossible, and I think we proved that with the Abraham Accords. Though, of course, the ground that we were working with was much more fertile than the ground that we now face. So impossible, no. Challenging, difficult. I don't want to say Herculean, but challenging and difficult, absolutely. But these are leaders who have unbelievable visions for their countries. They're young, they're excited, their population is excited. I don't think it's going to make it impossible. I think they're going to have a lot more work to do to sort of reset the clock, re-prepare the ground, if you will. And I still remain optimistic, though a lot of people are going to have to roll up a lot of sleeves to help undo the damage that was done because of what Hamas did. And let's remember this, right? In one day, 1,000 or so Hamas terrorists funded by the Iranian regime not only perpetrated a horrific massacre and all sorts of atrocities upon Israelis, and now untold suffering for the Palestinians in Gaza, but they've upset the entire world order, if you will. If this thing metastasizes to the region, Hamas, those 1,000 fighters, and of course the Iranian regime, with what I would say is a very small match, potentially lit up the world. It's bad enough if they don't light up the world. It's bad enough what's happening now. But imagine if it spreads beyond that. And I believe that the Arab leaders understand how things could change so quickly with these terrorist actors, these non-state actors, and of course the Iranian regime. And I think they understand that it's important for their national security and the future thriving of their people, the same way it is for Israel. They're very careful, they're really smart, and I think they'll approach it in a careful, smart way and kind of get us back on track. How quickly, I don't know, it's too soon to make any prediction. But again, my optimism bone, despite me hardly being able to sleep these last 3 weeks and constantly glued to the media, as I'm sure most of your audience is, and feeling sick over everything that's happened, I still have this glimmer of optimism in my head, knowing that we will get past this dark period. And I do think we're going to go back on track to variations of the Abraham Accords, if not full blown out Abraham Accords over time.
All right, Jason, thanks so much for joining us. For everyone out there watching, just a reminder, the title of his book is In the Path of Abraham, How Donald Trump Made Peace in the Middle East and How to Stop Joe Biden from Unmaking It, which you can get on Amazon. I'm Ryan Morrow, again, from the Arabian Peninsula Institute and also an investigative researcher at the Capital Research Center. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again, Jason. And everyone out there, make sure you follow us on Twitter, check out the website and all of that. You can follow me at Ryan Morrow on Twitter, Mauro, so that you're aware of future webinars that we'll be holding and you don't miss out on anything. Thanks so much for watching.
Thank you.